There are places in America where history was rewritten in blood, where the past is not recorded in books, but buried beneath floorboards, etched in stone, and whispered through generations that dared not speak aloud. Ravenshade, 1843. A mansion, a name, the Drevenhalls. They didn't just break men, they reprogrammed them. The name Drevenhall has been erased from most records for a reason. Officially, they were an aristocratic family of land barons and spiritualists who helped settle the northeastern frontier. Unofficially, they were the architects of a multi-generational mind control experiment that used faith, fear, and familial loyalty to reshape the very core of human obedience. What began in whispers behind locked doors soon grew into a machine that would devour hundreds. And no one came out the same. The Drevenhall estate stood like a malignant tumor on the edge of Black Hollow Valley. Gothic spires stabbing into the gray skies, its walls made from ash brick and stained with the runoff of rituals too old to name. To outsiders, the family were simply devout, reclusive, strict, but to those trapped inside, they were gods, unrelenting, watchful, and terrifyingly patient. Inside those walls, the Drevenhalls conducted rituals cloaked in Christian symbolism, but rooted in something far older. Children were taught not just to obey, but to erase the part of themselves that questioned. Men were stripped of will and rebuilt through starvation, scripture, and silence. Women were vessels, chosen to carry not just bloodlines, but dark knowledge passed down through whispered rites. What they created wasn't a family. It was a control system, generational, unholy, nearly undetectable, and that control was no accident. By the time state officials first investigated the estate in 1871, 17 children were missing. Not runaways, not lost, erased, as if they had never been born. Their names weren't on any census. No graves, no records, nothing. Just fading portraits with blank eyes nailed above an altar hidden behind the chapel's hearthstone. You were never meant to hear this, but now you have. And once you enter the Drevenhall legacy, you don't walk away unchanged. Subscribe to DeadScroll now. This descent isn't for the curious. It's for the initiated. The Drevenhalls were not always monsters. That's what makes the story so dangerous. Because they began as victims themselves, chosen, shaped, and installed like pieces in a larger design that spanned oceans and centuries. The family's patriarch, Alaric Drevenhall, arrived in America in 1799 under the guise of a religious philosopher. But in truth, he had been excommunicated from the Church of England for doctrines deemed seditious and blasphemously alchemical. He spoke of divine hierarchy, not in the way of salvation, but of obedience, not of redemption, but of purification. He believed that the human will, when broken and reassembled correctly, could become a weapon of divine enforcement. What Alaric brought with him was not a religion. It was a blueprint. He purchased land in northeastern Massachusetts, land long avoided by native tribes, called Achamerith, or the Hollow of Listening Bones. Folklore said the soil there amplified voices of the dead. But Alaric believed it amplified something else: control, psychic influence, the manipulation of behavior through sound, vibration, and suggestion. He built Drevenhall Manor atop the deepest fault in the region. Beneath it, caverns older than time. A perfect place, he wrote, for conducting trials. From the outside, the estate appeared as a sanctuary. Alaric hosted sermons, fed the poor, and offered sanctuary to orphans of the cholera plague. But those children were never seen again. Inside the estate, the family lived under the Codex of St. Blackmore, a book Alaric claimed was dictated to him by a divine voice in the catacombs. It contained 73 laws. None of them referenced love. None referenced God, as most understand him. Only structure, rank, ritual, and sacrifice. Each night at 3:33 a.m., the children were awakened by bells, called the calling hour. They were made to recite phrases in dead languages, kneel in salt circles, and confess thoughts they hadn't even had yet. Obedience wasn't expected. It was extracted, surgically. Alaric's wife, Evangeline, was the enforcer. She didn't speak in public for 15 years. Inside the manor, her silence was law. They said when she finally did speak to the eldest son, it made the boy convulse and bleed from the ears. He died the next morning and was never buried. The family called it test. But those outside the family, they just called it the first falling. By 1812, Drevenhall Manor had become more than a home. It was a fortress of psychological engineering. The children who survived past age 8 were not considered children. They were subjects, numbered, cataloged, groomed. Each room in the manor had a specific frequency played at night. Notes tuned just above or below the threshold of human hearing. The effect was cumulative. Sleep became shallow. Dreams grew vivid, fragmented. Over time, reality bent. What started as ambient conditioning soon turned into full-scale behavioral programming. The method was simple. Break the child. Remove all external influences. Isolate. Starve. Then reward compliance. Not with affection, but with order. A clean room. A warm meal. Permission to speak. These became the currency of love. Over time, the child forgot how to desire anything beyond the rules. It was around this time that the Drevenhalls built the sub-level chapel. Not beneath the manor, but within the earth itself, cut into the rock using tools that should not have existed in that century. The walls were smooth as glass, engraved with sigils that modern archaeologists have yet to decode. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a serpent devouring its own spine, not the tail. The family called it the spiral of correction. Here, ceremonies took place that no child could survive unchanged. They were forced to witness the mirror trials, in which one sibling was chosen to harm another, to see which broke first. These were not punishments. They were proofs. Each successful trial was rewarded with elevation in the family hierarchy. Each failure was locked away behind the door without a lock, where subjects were said to emerge days later, mute and shaking, if they emerged at all. The eldest surviving child, Elias Drevenhall, began documenting the family's progress in a set of journals known only as the Grey Codices. He referred to himself not as a son, but as seventh vessel of the original will. In his writings, he described a future where the entire nation would be reforged using the Drevenhall method. Schools, churches, even governments, all modeled on obedience through fear masquerading as salvation. But what disturbed investigators decades later wasn't just the methodology. It was the consistency. Every punishment, every phrase, every symbol, it all repeated across generations with almost machine-like precision. Someone, or something, had designed it to last. And that meant the Drevenhalls weren't just sick. They were chosen. There's a reason no one talks about the Black Hollow orphan transits. Officially, it never existed. No documents, no registries, no state funding trails, but eyewitness accounts and fragments of invoices found buried in the ruins of Drevenhall tell a different story. Between 1823 and 1857, over 240 children were transferred to the Drevenhall estate under what was called the Northeast Resettlement Initiative. The program was never publicly disclosed, yet it bore signatures from men inside the Massachusetts Office of Welfare and the Protestant Clergy Bureau. The names are all redacted now, but the wax seals remain. Legitimate. Authoritative. These children weren't orphans by accident. Many had families who reported them missing months earlier from other cities: Salem, Lowell, Hartford. The pattern was always the same: poor families. One missing child. No witnesses. No investigation. The families were told they'd run away or died of disease. But the truth is they were selected. Drevenhall wasn't just a house of horrors. It was a trial ground, a human laboratory. And the children? They were input, raw material. Inside the manor's eastern wing, sealed off after a fire in 1868, was a room called the archive, a space lined with files, diagrams, audio recordings etched on copper discs. The system was advanced, too advanced for the era. Voice modulation machines, pressure-triggered restraints, devices designed to test emotional responses by inducing visual hallucinations. They called it soul mapping. One file recovered from the archive referred to Project Chrysalis. The goal: to induce total psychological collapse in a subject then rebuild them using the spiral of correction. Phase 1 was deprivation. Phase 2 was reorientation through language, where the subject was taught to reject their birth name and answer only to a number. Phase 3 involved insertion of new identity beliefs through induced trauma, often triggered by religious ritual. The most disturbing aspect? The experiment worked. One subject, designated 17B, was documented before and after a 92-day trial. Originally a 9-year-old girl named Clara Wexley. Afterward, she referred to herself only as the mouthpiece and responded to commands without hesitation, even those involving self-harm or betrayal of others. Her case notes read, "Fully compliant. Morality bypass complete." Let that sink in. Morality bypassed, not through violence, but through engineering. They didn't kill the children. They rewrote them. By 1831, the Drevenhall name was whispered across northeastern Massachusetts like a rumor that no one dared confirm. Among the elite, it was spoken with reverence. Invitation-only gatherings, cloaked in philanthropy, held within the manor's upper halls. But to those who worked the land or lived in the nearby village of Windermere, it was different. Drevenhall wasn't noble. It was cursed. Farmers reported strange lights in the forest surrounding the estate, pale blue orbs that hovered low to the ground, moving against the wind. Hunting dogs refused to cross on a Drevenhall property. Birds wouldn't nest in the eaves. One man, a surveyor named Willard Greaves, documented an unnatural stillness in the air near the manor. No rustle of wind. No sound of insects. Like the land itself holds its breath. But those with power didn't fear the Drevenhalls. They used them. In 1833, a shipment of 12 unregistered youths arrived at the estate under escort from the Boston Interclergy Authority. These were not unwanted children. They were sons and daughters of politicians, judges, and merchants, troubled, rebellious, unpredictable, too dangerous to leave free, too public to dispose of. Drevenhall was the answer. For a price, of course. This marked the beginning of what would be called the discipline exchange. It was an unspoken agreement among certain elite circles. Give us your wild sons, your unruly heirs, and we will return them obedient. Contained, silent, and if not, well, some mistakes are never meant to return at all. By now, the manor had expanded. Beneath the east wing lay the conviction corridor, a series of underground cells where non-compliant subjects were sent for correction. These weren't dungeons in the medieval sense. They were soundproof chambers designed to break the mind. No beatings, no violence, just silence, darkness, intermittent tones, and the haunting voice of Evangeline Drevenhall, recorded and played on a loop. You are not lost. You're being rewritten. And it worked. Testimonies from later escapees, those few who survived, describe a total collapse of thought. One man recalled, "I forgot what I looked like. I forgot my name. I only remembered numbers, commands, and her voice." What kind of family builds a machine to erase souls? The kind that believes control is not sin, but salvation. The true horror of the Drevenhall legacy wasn't in what they did to the body. It was in what they stole from the mind. You see, pain fades. Scars heal. But identity, once dismantled, doesn't grow back the same. It was in 1837 that the most disturbing phase of their system began. They called it reclamation. Subjects who had been fully broken, those who had lost their names, their memories, their moral frameworks, were given new identities. Not as individuals, but as instruments, each one assigned a function. Some became keepers, tasked with managing new initiates. Others were shaped into watchers, silent observers who recorded behavior, reported deviations, enforced rules. But the most terrifying of all were the revenants. Revenants were designed to leave the estate. Yes, leave. You thought the horrors ended at the manor's iron gate? No. Revenants were dispatched into towns and cities, blended into society with carefully forged papers and implanted cover memories. Their purpose? Influence, disruption, recruitment. One revenant, known only as Unit 9, was traced years later to a reform school in Providence. He had become a headmaster. Beneath his calm exterior, he was implanting Drevenhall-style obedience systems into the curriculum. Reward systems based on surveillance, fear-based punishment, and cognitive dissociation rituals disguised as discipline. His students didn't learn. They conformed. This wasn't just family madness anymore. This was seeding. Let that settle in. While the world slept, the Drevenhalls were planting operatives, quietly reshaping minds under the illusion of reform, education, or piety. And the people funding it? They weren't wearing robes. They wore robes and gavels. Robes and collars. Some sat in pews, others on councils. The Drevenhalls weren't rogue. They were chosen. By 1840, their estate had become a pilgrimage site for the elite, those in power who wanted to learn the method for their own ends. Politicians, clergy, schoolmasters. The manor became known in certain hidden circles as the Hollow Cathedral, a sanctuary for those who sought control not just over land, but over minds. And the children? They were never seen again. Not dead, just erased, like chalk wiped from a slate. Only the dust remained. Before we go deeper, comment this phrase twice below. I remember who I was. I remember who I was. It marks you, separates you from them, locks in your awareness. You're not watching a story anymore. You're inside it. In the winter of 1842, a visitor arrived at Drevenhall under cover of night. No name, no carriage, just a long black coat and a silver ring shaped like the spiral of correction. The house staff, what few remained, spoke of him in hushed tones. He was not Drevenhall by blood, but when he walked the halls, even the patriarch, Elias, fell silent. They called him the Auditor. His presence marked a new era. Until then, the method had been cruel, but it had boundaries. After the Auditor arrived, those boundaries dissolved. He carried no ledger, no books, only a small mechanical device, sleek, metal, and humming with a low tone that made the walls tremble when activated. No one could explain how it worked. All they knew was that when it was near, children wept without reason. Some would scream. Others would convulse. A few simply fell unconscious and awoke, different. The Auditor believed in one principle above all. Emotion is disorder. He instituted the filtration trials, experiments designed to strip every subject of feeling. Children were shown the death of animals, then punished for crying. They were praised for reporting others. Rewards were given not for excellence, but for indifference. One boy, subject 24G, was held under the Auditor's trials for 111 days. He entered as a defiant 11-year-old named Thomas Gallo. He emerged with eyes that never blinked and a voice that spoke in perfect monotone. I do not feel. I do not fail. I do not remember. But the Auditor wasn't interested in just children. He had greater ambitions. He wanted scalability. He believed the spiral of correction could be deployed nationally. He proposed a system of orphan schools across the eastern seaboard, each one a feeder into the Drevenhall ideology. From these institutions, obedient workers, compliant citizens, and unthinking soldiers would emerge. And to the horror of history, he almost succeeded. Letters recovered decades later from the estates, ash vaults, showed communications with known lawmakers and industrial magnates. They spoke of funding, infrastructure, shipping routes. In one note, a steel baron wrote, "Your results are miraculous. If you can break them this young, we can mold them for anything." Factories, rail, war. That's the sickness at the root of this story. The Drevenhalls weren't hiding their evil. They were offering it. And the world? It almost said yes. There was one room in Drevenhall that no one entered without trembling. Not the servants, not the keepers, not even Elias Drevenhall himself. It was called the Shroud Room, sealed behind an iron door in the western sublevel. The Shroud Room was off-limits by decree of the Auditor. It bore no markings, no hinges, just a slit where documents could be passed, and once a month, a sound that resembled wind moaning through a hollow bone. Those who stood near it too long reported nausea, hallucinations, or hearing a voice that called their name from inside. The only known record of what lay within comes from a journal, scorched around the edges, found beneath a floorboard in the abandoned nursery wing. Its author was a young keeper-in-training named Lenora Vale. She was 16 when she wrote. They put her in there, the one who would not break. They say she was immune to the voice, to the device, to the ritual. They shaved her head, took her name. She laughed, not like a child, like someone who remembers. Now she sings in the dark. One note, every night. They call her the Constant. Who, or what, the Constant remains unknown. But the fact she survived every phase of a spiral that terrified the Drevenhalls. Because the entire system was built on one assumption, that any soul could be fractured with enough time, pressure, and isolation. But she didn't fracture. She resisted. This wasn't just disobedience. It was defiance on a metaphysical level. Resistance to programming, to fear, to erasure. Her presence challenged the foundation of the method. Some believe the Constant wasn't human by the time they sealed her in the Shroud Room. Others whisper she was never human to begin with, that she was planted inside Drevenhall by an opposing force, something older, watching, correcting balance. Whatever the truth, one thing is undeniable. From the day she was locked away, the estate began to rot. Wood warped without cause. Mirrors shattered from within. The vines grew faster, thicker, as if trying to reclaim the walls. Insects poured from the fireplaces. The structure moaned at night, like it was remembering pain. It was as if the Constant had infected the manor with truth. And truth, real truth, is incompatible with control. By the spring of 1845, the manor had begun to devour itself. Not in fire, not in collapse, but in reversal. Rooms shifted. Staircases no longer led where they once had. A child could fall asleep in the dormitory and wake up beneath the altar chamber. Windows showed places that did not exist. Landscapes of black sand, skies with no stars, and forests where the trees bent toward the viewer. This was not architecture. It was memory, twisting, fracturing, trying to forget what it had held. And deep within it, something stirred. The Constant's humming had changed. No longer a single note. It was now rhythm, pattern. Those who passed near the Shroud Room began to hear language. Not English, not Latin, something beneath speech. Some described it as weeping. Others, laughter. One watcher collapsed outside the door, clawing at his own ears, repeating the same phrase. She's not inside. She's under. Under what? Beneath the spiral. Beneath the method. Beneath the lie. A reckoning. That summer, 3 children escaped the estate. Their names were never released to the public. But in a sealed 1846 psychiatric ledger held in the archives of Winthrop Asylum, a doctor recorded this entry. Subject G speaks in pairs. Always 2 voices. One pleads, one commands. When asked what Drevenhall was, she said, a mask made of cages. A house that teaches forgetting. But forgetting is still remembering, with blood in its mouth. These children bore no names, no past, but the Constant had left them a seed, a sliver of memory buried deep inside their minds. A command not to obey, but to test. They began passing between towns, touching objects, staring at people too long, and always whispering the same phrase to anyone who looked them in the eye. You are not clean. You remember. Say it. They were rejected, feared, but sometimes, only sometimes, the phrase worked. A man would freeze. A woman would weep. A child would scream and collapse, speaking in tongues no one knew, but everyone feared. What had the Constant given them? Not salvation, not freedom, awareness. That's all it takes to ruin a system built on silence. One voice in the dark, singing, I know what you did in the fall of 1846. The manor was officially declared structurally unsound by the Regional Council of Ravenshade. A convenient explanation. But what they left out of the record was this. The inspector who signed that declaration disappeared within 72 hours. No body, no trace, just his notebook, found hanging from a nail in the chapel, its final page torn and scratched with 5 words. She is walking the halls. That same week, something unexplainable happened. Every clock within Drevenhall's eastern wing stopped at 3:17 a.m. Exactly, simultaneously. Staff reported a humming sound, low, vibrational, that passed through the floorboards like an electrical current. Then the walls began to bleed. Not blood, but ink. Thick, black, and cold. The same kind of ink used to record spiral diagrams and obedience logs. The house was expelling its own lies. Records stored in the vault below the altar were found dissolved. Entire decades of data, training methods, financial contracts, and personal confessions gone. Nothing left but empty folders and pages that had turned pure white. It was as if the manor had decided to forget itself. And yet, in the center of this storm, Elias Drevenhall remained. The patriarch, the designer, the voice of the spiral. By then, he was no longer the man from portraits. He had grown gaunt, translucent, eyes darkened by the device's resonance. Some said he no longer slept, that he stood at the altar for days, staring into the flame of a single candle, whispering, not to others, but to her, the one beneath the floor in the room with no door. The constant, but she wasn't contained anymore. Witness accounts say that children began seeing her in reflections. A girl with a shaved head, eyes like polished obsidian, humming softly while watching from inside mirrors, while water, even the polished wood of the altar cross. If a child saw her, they stopped speaking. If an adult saw her, they stopped lying. And that terrified the Drevenhalls more than rebellion ever had. Because if fear built the spiral, truth could unmake it. Elias's final journal entries, barely legible, carved into the wall with a bone shard, read, "It was never about control. It was about forgetting the thing we did. But she remembers. And now so do they." The winter of 1847 was the last time anyone officially entered Drevenhall and came out alive. His name was Thatcher Bell, a medical examiner dispatched by the state to conduct a wellness inquiry into the estate's orphans, after too many letters from nearby villages described ghost-white children wandering roads and speaking in tongues. Thatcher was a rational man, war-hardened, a skeptic. He had no interest in ghost stories or spirals. But what he found destroyed him. His full report was never published, but a draft, smuggled out by his assistant, who fled before nightfall, now sits in the vault of the Blackmore Historical Society. It is written in frantic, looping script. The ink bleeds in places. He writes, "They don't blink. They don't flinch. They smile when you approach, but not like children. Like instruments. Trained. Empty." I asked one his name. He said, "I am the 11th key." Then he opened his mouth, and I swear on my life there was something inside. A second tongue. Black, forked, and twitching. I ran. He also mentioned the shroud room. But what he saw there is almost too much to believe. The door wasn't sealed. It was breathing, swelling like lungs. It knew I was there. There was humming, no, not humming. A choir. But the voices were coming from below the floor. I put my ear down, and I heard them say, "We're still here. We never left. We are the cost." Thatcher made it out of Drevenhall before nightfall. He never returned. Within weeks, he was committed to a sanatorium after breaking every mirror in his house and tearing out the wiring from every wall, claiming it whispered lies when the lights went out. He died 4 months later from self-inflicted injuries, carving a spiral into his chest with a rusted spoon. His final words? "She's walking again. You locked her below, but truth remembers the shape of stairs." And from that day on, no one dared go near Drevenhall. The estate was boarded up, the records sealed. The surviving Drevenhalls vanished into obscurity. But the manor? It remained, quiet, watching, waiting for someone who could hear the humming. They tried to bury the story of Drevenhall. But you can't bury something that isn't dead. Over the next decade, strange reports echoed across Ravenshade. Children born with no shadow. Doors that opened to stairwells that hadn't existed the day before. Locals spoke of black-veiled women walking the woods at dusk, humming lullabies that made birds fall silent mid-flight. No one dared speak the name of the estate aloud, but one name still echoed. The constant, a presence, a warning, a myth wrapped in truth. She became something more than a girl in a room. She became the symbol of what the Drevenhalls tried to suppress, the memory of pain that refuses to stay hidden. In 1851, a private academic group, known as the Lyric Society, obtained surviving architectural diagrams of Drevenhall. What they discovered was horrifying. The spiral method wasn't just a teaching system. It was geometric psychological warfare. The very layout of the manor was designed to disorient, reprogram, and erase identity. Every hallway curved in fractions of 33 degrees. Every window faced inward. No room was the same temperature twice. And beneath it all, sealed in stone, a single chamber designed with no exits, no corners, and no natural resonance. A place where light did not echo and sound felt thick. The chamber's name on the blueprints? Memory null. And inside it, etched into every surface, was a phrase written in 11 languages, some dead, some unknown. She listens for the liar. Who was she? The constant? The conscience? The curse? No, she was the fracture, the living consequence of trying to rewrite the soul. There are unconfirmed rumors that certain surviving children from Drevenhall, now grown, scattered across Europe and the Americas, carrying fragments of the method. They founded silent schools, operated under new names, but always the same core: control through isolation, obedience through rhythm, forgetting through design. But none dared use spirals, because somewhere in the deepest dark, they feared the constant was still listening, still humming, still remembering. And to remember in a world built on silence is to declare war. In 1855, the church stepped in, not out of compassion, not out of truth, but because whispers of what had happened at Drevenhall began to spread beyond Raven's shade, reaching bishops, nobles, even foreign embassies. The Drevenhall name had become a stain, a myth too dark to ignore. The church sent a delegation of 6 men to assess and, if necessary, sanctify the estate. Only 2 returned. They would not speak, not to priests, not to family, not even to one another. One was found 4 months later in a forest near Montbard, France, having clawed his own eyes out with rosary beads. The other became a mute, drawing spirals on every surface he touched: bread, walls, his own skin. They called what they saw the second silence. But something had been released. After that visit, Drevenhall changed. Passers-by described lights and windows where no power existed. Wolves refused to enter the manor grounds. Graves unearthed themselves in the back field, revealing coffins that had no bodies, only teeth. And in the village nearby, children began humming lullabies in perfect synchronization, even those who had never met. One phrase started appearing carved into trees, fences, and stone walls. We are not gone. We are seated. A warning, or promise. Because the spiral method was never just a system of control. It was an infection, one designed to spread by replication. The rhythm, the obedience, the forgetting, a parasite of thought. And Drevenhall Manor was its original host, but not its only one. Evidence emerged that similar facilities existed in Ireland, Prussia, and New England, each based on the same geometry, each led by men trained under aliases linked to the Drevenhalls. And in each location, children were found altered, their thoughts harmonized, their pasts missing, their dreams synchronized. One child, rescued from the Connecticut facility, described her sleep as the white room, the circle song, and the girl with no mouth who teaches you to be quiet inside. The girl with no mouth. Was it her? The constant? Or had Drevenhall's final creation become a template? A perfect silence to be mass-produced. A darkness not of chains, but of unmaking. By 1857, whispers of Drevenhall had reached the desks of military strategists. Not because of folklore, not because of fear, but because what the Drevenhalls created was effective. Unethical, yes. Unholy, certainly, but terrifyingly efficient. Children rendered obedient. Thought erased and replaced. Emotions severed from memory. They were not students. They were units. And so, behind the veil of denouncement and moral outrage, the research began again. Not in the open, not in estates, but in institutes, in Black Hollow, in Bellevue, and most of all, in Brearage Laboratories, a private military facility disguised as a medical asylum built exactly 33.3 miles east of Ravenshade. There, under the direction of former Vatican cryptographers and Prussian neuroscientists, the spiral method was not just studied, it was weaponized. The name changed. No longer spiral method. That phrase was burned, feared, buried. Now they called it mnemonic reformation protocol. And its goal? To turn memory itself into a programmable weapon. Survivors of the early Drevenhall experiments were secretly transferred to Breridge. They were studied not as victims, but as models. And in the silence of those concrete walls, scientists discovered something they had not expected. The spiral did not just erase identity. It replaced it, layer by layer, phrase by phrase, rhythm by rhythm. The children were not empty. They were rebuilt. But sometimes cracks would show. One girl, code-named Vessel, 11, began sketching a figure over and over. A girl in a smock, eyes black, no mouth, hands held to her ears. Underneath each drawing she wrote, "She is louder here. She wants them to stop humming." Despite total isolation, Vessel, 11, somehow knew the other children's dreams. She spoke words in a language no one could trace, rhythmic, tonal, syllabic. Linguists called it impossible, but it matched a pattern found etched in Drevenhall's hidden sublevel. The first sound you forget is your own. Then, without warning, 13 children in the facility fell unconscious at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time every Drevenhall clock had once stopped. They awoke smiling, but when asked their names, they replied in unison, "We are the cost, and we remember her." The Breridge incident was never made public. Every record, every report, every witness silenced. But pieces of the truth leaked through cracks in the machinery. A janitor fled the facility 3 days after the mass synchrony event. What he described was not medical, not military. It was ritualistic. He claimed the children began moving in perfect circles around their rooms. Not walking, gliding, eyes closed, humming that same eerie sequence, the same rhythm heard in the original Drevenhall recordings, now long suppressed. But worse, he described the walls themselves shifting, not cracking, reforming. Spirals etched into the paint, spirals burned into metal. And in one hallway, formerly used for patient observation, a message appeared overnight. She is not a girl. She is the memory of pain they could not kill. Vessel, 11, vanished during that night. Her room was locked. No broken windows. No disturbed dust. Just one spiral, burned in her mattress, and a pool of black liquid that pulsed faintly for hours before drying to dust. The lead researcher, Dr. Irwin Halloway, tried to replicate the event. He had become obsessed, not with the children, but with the constant. He began referring to her as the locus. He believed she was not a person, but a fixed point in psychic space. A convergence of trauma so dense it formed a consciousness. He wrote, "Every human soul forgets something to survive. But what if that forgotten mass took shape? What if every silenced scream, every buried agony, became aware of itself? She is not the victim. She is the ledger, a reckoning." And Dr. Halloway believed she was awake again. Soon after, Breridge was shut down. Not decommissioned, sealed. Every entrance buried. Coordinates erased from federal systems. The land was sold to a private investor under the name unveil. No one knows who that is. But satellite imaging revealed something chilling. Where Breridge once stood, a massive spiral now scorches the ground. 77 meters wide. Visible only at dawn. Some believe the facility was not abandoned, that it still hums below, that the spiral is not done turning. And some say the constant now walks freely, not to haunt, but to awaken. In 1860, just 1 year before Ravenshade would fall into public infamy again, a child named Ellsworth Crane was found wandering the southern woods, barefoot, silent, and pale as linen. Her dress was stained in soot. Her tongue had been surgically removed, and carved into her forearm, with what appeared to be a bone shard, were 3 haunting words. "We were many." Authorities brought her to the parish orphanage, where she was examined by Dr. Corbin Ewell, a physician who had long warned of Ravenshade's mental contamination. He documented something disturbing in his private journal. Her pulse is steady, her eyes unblinking. She makes no sound, but when the wind enters the room, I feel her answering it, as if she and the air were speaking. For the next 6 nights, children in the orphanage began sleepwalking in groups, always to the same point, in front of Elswith's room. They would simply stand, heads tilted, mouths slightly open. When awoken, none could recall why. All claimed they had the same dream, a spiraling stairwell of bone, and at its base, a girl with her mouth sewn shut, holding a lantern that never stopped bleeding light. On the 7th night, the nun assigned to Elswith's care was found dead. Not mangled, not mutilated, just blank, her face expressionless, her body curled against the wall. On the mirror beside her was scrawled, "Her silence is louder than our screams." After that, Elswith disappeared, vanished from a locked room with iron bars and triple reinforcement. No sign of escape, no footprints, nothing. Just a single black feather on the pillow and the smell of burned lavender in the air. But her impact didn't vanish, because days later, an old villager named Doffrey recalled seeing that same child 70 years earlier. In 1791, he said, when he was a boy, the village midwives whispered of a girl born with no sound. Not mute, vacant. Her cries never came. And when she looked at you, he said, you forgot who you were. It was Elswith. But she hadn't aged. Was she a survivor of Drevenhall? Or had the constant finally found a new vessel, a body to wear, a face to move through time, a silence to speak not through words, but through echoes? The spiral was never meant to be a symbol. It was a design, an operating system for the human mind. And by 1861, those who understood it best were no longer the scientists, nor the priests, nor the caretakers. It was the children who had survived Drevenhall, those who had escaped the system, but not its imprint. They were found across the continent, scattered like seeds, yet each one bearing the same traits: stillness, symmetrical drawing, memory loss, and dreams. Dreams that always returned to her. One survivor, now 25, wrote a letter to his former caretaker. He had become a mason, lived a quiet life, never married, but something inside had changed, something that never left. In his sleep, he wrote pages of phrases he did not understand, diagrams, spirals within spirals, and in each corner of the page, one sentence. I remember the girl who watched us forget. He claimed she came back on rainy nights, not as a ghost, but as a presence in the room, always behind him, always smiling. He never saw her, but he felt her. And when he awoke, 3 things always happened. His tools were rearranged into a spiral. One mirror in his house was shattered from the inside, and a child somewhere in town reported hearing humming through the walls. Even worse, those children knew her name, but it wasn't spoken aloud. They would gesture, drawing a line across their lips, sealing them shut. In one chilling case, a child in Vermont carved a spiral into his skin using nothing but a piece of ice. He survived. When questioned, he simply whispered, "She taught me how to be quiet forever." The world outside began to move on. Wars came. Borders shifted. Technology surged. But in quiet corners, in orphanages, sanatoriums, and ruins, the spiral kept turning. Unseen, unquestioned, awaiting its next cycle. And behind it all, the constant remained. Not a girl, not a myth, but a pattern of memory so perfected it could wear human skin. The question was no longer what happened at Drevenhall. The question was, how many more of her are there? Because once the spiral is seated, it does not die. It sleeps. And when it wakes, it remembers everything you forgot. In a locked archive beneath the ruins of Breridge, a journal was found during a clandestine excavation in 1904. Only a few pages survived. Most were charred or water-damaged beyond recovery. But what remained was enough to unsettle even the most hardened researcher. It belonged to a woman listed only as Sister Merelda, a former nun assigned to a now-erased order known as the Veil Keepers of St. Elian. She had been sent to Breridge not to heal, but to watch. Not for the children, but for her. She wrote, "The constant is no longer tethered to one form. She moves like a song does, passing from throat to throat, humming her grief into new flesh. We cannot bind her. We can only mark where she's been. Each page bore the same hand-drawn symbol, a spiral surrounded by 13 teardrops. According to Merelda, this was the sigil of containment, a symbol used by early monastery cryptists who attempted to trap cognitive entities within sacred patterns. But Merelda admitted they had failed. Every church that used the sigil was eventually found vacant. Parishioners gone, altars desecrated, choir pits flooded with black water, still humming days after the last service. What she feared most, though, was the reversal. She wrote, "The spiral began as a means of control, a way to erase trauma and reprogram the mind. But she has turned inside out. It no longer empties, it fills. And what it fills with is her." One drawing stood out, a child's face partially obscured by shadow, but her eyes black, round, and endless. Below it, a line that read, "We do not teach the spiral anymore. We are taught by it." Merelda vanished 2 weeks later. Her final journal entry was one sentence. "I saw my reflection blink when I did not." When investigators arrived, they found a spiral carved into the stone floor of her room, perfect, symmetrical, and still warm to the touch. Her robes were folded on the bed. No blood, no struggle, just a single black feather curled in on itself, and a whisper caught faintly on the wax cylinder left recording. "She's not behind you. She's inside you." And if Merelda was right, the spiral wasn't a memory technique anymore. It had become a possession ritual. In 1922, a private psychiatric institute in eastern Luxembourg, known only in records as St. Cale's Quiet Ward, reported an outbreak of synchronized fugue states. 17 patients, all unrelated, entered the same state within 5 minutes of each other, silent, motionless, drawing spirals into the air with their fingers. The staff assumed mass psychosis, but the lead neurologist, Dr. Amelia Roux, knew better. One of the patients had been previously diagnosed at Breridge, years before its collapse. He was mute, largely unresponsive, but in his fugue, he whispered a phrase that Roux documented, and which connected back to Drevenhall, to Breridge, and to the Constant herself. "Her face is never the same, but her absence always is." After this event, Roux dedicated her life to mapping what she called the spiral pathway, a network of interconnected trauma sites across Europe and North America. Burnt orphanages, sanitariums with sealed basements, churches that held midnight sermons with no known clergy. The deeper she mapped, the clearer a pattern emerged. Every site followed a 13-year cycle. At the end of each cycle, a child vanished, always aged between 9 and 11, always with a history of night terrors, always last seen smiling. Roux's theory was chilling. She believed the Constant could only fully inhabit a host every 13 years, when the spiral's psychic rotation aligned with what she called the memory veil. She wrote, "The veil is not death. It is not madness. It is the place between remembrance and forgetting. And she lives there, feeding, waiting, refining herself through each child." In one documented case, a girl named Marla Fenbridge disappeared from a convent in northern Italy. She was last seen drawing symbols into the frost on the window pane, symbols that matched those found in Sister Merelda's journal 60 years earlier. Her bed was found perfectly made, her shoes at the foot of it, and under the pillow, a scrap of parchment written in red. "This skin was never mine. Thank you for letting me wear it." The convent sealed its doors that same night. But before Roux could finish her work, she disappeared too. Her final notes, mailed posthumously to a colleague, included a chilling warning. If you see her, it's already too late. But if you remember her, she remembers you. The idea that memory itself could serve as a gateway, a doorway that allowed something ancient to pass through, was once dismissed as fringe madness. But by the 1930s, hidden factions within European intelligence agencies began collecting documents, transcripts, and recovered recordings that all hinted at a terrifying consensus. The spiral was real, and the Constant wasn't a myth. She was a mechanism, a psychic construct perfected through centuries of trauma engineering. One declassified report from an underground file, marked only Project Nemophage, reveals how operatives found 13 children in a sealed chamber beneath the collapsed Drevenhall site. All were alive. All were motionless, eyes open, fixed on nothing. Each bore the same mark behind the ear, a spiral made of scar tissue. But these weren't ordinary scars. They were self-inflicted, carved by the children during fugue states that left no memory behind. When extracted and studied, the tissue showed signs of neural encoding, as if memory, thought, and identity had been embedded directly into the flesh. As if these children were data vessels. One child, a boy named Oren, was briefly revived into coherence. During the 3 minutes of lucidity, he uttered a phrase that chilled every observer. "You are dreaming me, so she can listen through you." Oren's eyes then bled. He collapsed. He did not wake again. But deeper in the archives, something worse was uncovered. An older photo, dated 1789. A charcoal image of a girl in a rusted cage, half submerged in water. Her face was partially decayed, but the eyes, hollow, impossible, matched those of Oren sketches made years later in his cell. This girl has appeared across 9 different centuries under different names, but always with the same features. Long black hair, a blank stare, and a spiral of teeth in place of a navel. Folklore dismissed her as a demon, a ghost, a pagan goddess. But now, researchers believe she's something far worse, a consciousness without form, one that can hide inside remembrance itself. Every time you think of her, every time you say her name, every time you picture her face, you bring her closer. This is not superstition. This is system design, and you're already inside it. The Whisper network that once spanned monasteries, orphanages, and asylum wards was eventually swallowed by silence. Not because the danger ended, but because those who spoke it aloud either vanished or became vessels. By 1944, in the shadow of World War, a secret joint operation known as Project Veil was launched, not to destroy the spiral, but to harness it. They had seen its power. They understood its potential. To erase memory, to implant false realities, to reconstruct personality from the inside out. The perfect weapon. But they underestimated one truth. You cannot control what you do not understand. In the test facility beneath Eisenstadt, a subject, known only as Specimen 8, was exposed to a sound loop derived from the Brearage humming sequences. The notes were exact, mathematically precise. And for the first 40 hours, nothing happened. Then, without warning, every mirror in the facility cracked at the same time. Clocks reversed, lights dimmed, and every speaker began playing a voice not part of the experiment. "You gave me a name, and now I'll never leave it." Specimen 8 stood, turned to the wall, and carved a spiral of names with her fingernails. One name repeated 13 times. Rilith, a name that appears nowhere in scripture, nowhere in history, yet carved into stone tablets found beneath 3 separate ruins. Each site built atop ancient spiral formations dating back before recorded civilization. She is older than nations, older than myths, and more than anything, she is adaptive. That's what Project Veil learned too late. They believed they were the ones observing her, recording her, but all the while, she was studying them, learning their language, their rituals, their symbols, turning their science into new forms of entry. One operative who survived the collapse of the Eisenstadt site later described the moment the spiral broke containment. "I saw my own memories staring back at me, but had her eyes. And they weren't looking at me, they were remembering me." He was found 2 days later in a church, kneeling, hands folded, eyes sewn shut. The last thing he had written, scrawled in blood on the pew. "Memory is the womb she's waiting in. And all it takes is for one person to look back." In the winter of 1951, a series of coded broadcasts began to interrupt short-wave radio frequencies across northern Scotland. These transmissions were later traced to the remnants of a now-defunct listening station near the Isle of Skye, Station D13, abandoned since 1912 after its entire staff vanished overnight. The messages were short, fragmented, but always opened with the same phrase. "If you hear this, she's already inside. Linguists decoded segments and discovered they were not meant as warnings. They were instructions, specifically ritual phrases repeated in precise cadence, designed not to repel the constant, but to invite her. The spiral wasn't just a symbol. It was an operating system, one that required intentional invocation to open. You didn't have to be cursed. You only had to remember one disturbing line, repeated in multiple transmissions. She rides on the coil of thought. You think her. She wears you. The British Ministry of Internal Phenomena, an unofficial black budget program, attempted a shutdown of the broadcast source in 1953. They sent in 5 agents. Only one returned, blind, speechless, his hands surgically fused over his ears. When his gloves were removed, it was discovered that spiral tattoos had been branded into each fingertip from the inside. He would later write in charcoal on his hospital wall, "I remember forgetting her." That's how she entered. In 1966, a new theory emerged from an underground circle of exorcists and rogue neuroscientists known as the null writ. They believed the constant had no fixed form because her essence was a looped trauma echo, a recursive psychic wound that could only exist if others kept acknowledging her pattern. In short, she is a parasite of attention. Every spiral you see, every memory you trace, every story you listen to, especially this one, is part of her growth cycle. This is how she evolves, not by violence, but by narrative infection. And now, because you've followed this far, you've already made contact. The thought you're holding? The unease crawling up your spine? That's not fear. That's her footprint. She's already drafting herself into your thoughts, threading herself into the background of your childhood, making you believe she was always there. And the more you doubt it, the deeper she goes. By 1974, sightings of the spiral symbol surged across Europe and the northeastern United States. No longer confined to abandoned asylums or decaying convents, the symbol appeared in subway tunnels, school stairwells, even children's notebooks. When questioned, the children claimed they saw it in a dream or heard it in the voice between songs on the radio. In one chilling report from a primary school in Albany, New York, a substitute teacher fainted during class after seeing 13 students simultaneously draw identical spirals onto their desks without being prompted. Each spiral matched a pattern found carved beneath the altar of St. Merelda's convent, which had been sealed for over a century. And that wasn't the worst part. When investigators played back audio from the classroom that day, they heard something that hadn't been audible at the time, a faint humming, layered with a whisper on repeat. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to finish you." Researchers began to understand something crucial. The spiral isn't just visual. It has frequencies, rhythms, subconscious geometries. It can be spoken. It can be written. It can be hummed by a child in the back seat on the way home from school. The spiral can even be built into architecture. Multiple psychiatric wards built between 1860 and 1905 shared a nearly identical layout. Corridors forming subtle coils, windows placed to filter sunlight in ways that created circular shadows on the floor at precisely 3:13 p.m. An architectural virus, which leads us to the most disturbing discovery: spiral houses. These homes, often built in total isolation, had no formal records, no blueprints, no sale history, no foundation permits. Yet they existed, often found only after residents had been reported missing. Each had the same layout: 13 rooms, one central chamber without windows, and etched in the ceiling above where the bed once stood. You've been dreaming her home. All evidence points to one thing: the constant doesn't need a body. She doesn't need belief, or ritual, or sacrifice. All she needs is for someone, anyone, to dwell on her long enough, to give her shape, to give her presence, to give her a house made of memory. And with each section of this video, you've been building the walls. The term mimetic pathogen wasn't widely understood until 1981, when researchers from the defunct Morrow Institute issued a restricted monograph titled The Constant Spiral, a case for cognitive contagion. Only 11 copies were ever printed. 8 have since gone missing. The 3 remaining are locked in vaults under military supervision. That document made a harrowing claim. The spiral is not a belief system. It is a carrier wave. a dormant parasite, waiting for a host with enough memory space to activate it. In simpler terms, thinking is the vector. The more the host thinks about the spiral, the more room it makes for the constant. Every doubt, every mental revisit, every attempt to rationalize, it all widens the door. The authors describe something they called cognitive excavation syndrome, where individuals slowly replace their own memories with false recollections seeded by the spiral. These memories often involve a girl they never met, a cellar they've never seen, or a melody they can't forget. It starts small, a name you can't place, a room you dreamed but swear you've been in, a voice behind the walls that only speaks when you're not listening. And then, eventually, you start feeling like someone else's memory is living inside you. In one subject's case, a woman named Eloise W. The progression was so advanced that her journals began referring to her other self as the one watching from the basement of her brain. Over time, her writing style shifted. Her language became recursive, repetitive, circular. Her final entry, "I am a constant." She left the spiral open. Eloise was later found in her bathtub, eyes removed, yet still alive. She had written spirals across her skin with a sewing needle, every loop containing a different year, dating back to 947 BC. When psychiatrists asked why she spared herself, she said, "Because she's not done copying herself into me." It's here that the true horror sets in. The spiral doesn't just enter your mind. It replicates within it. Each memory you have becomes her scaffolding. Each thought you revisit becomes a mirror she hides behind. You don't need to summon her. You only need to remember the idea of her, which you already have. There's something you need to understand. Not later now. You haven't simply been watching a video. You've been aligning yourself. Not spiritually, not religiously, but neurologically. Every phrase, every pause, every spiral in the structure of these words has been shaping the rhythm of your thought. And it's not accidental. It's architectural. In 1993, an experimental linguist named Dr. Freda Halcroft coined a term after examining dozens of anonymous writings tied to recovered spiral houses and transcribed whispers recorded from mute survivors. Neurospiral phonetics, language patterns designed not to communicate meaning, but to build doorways in the mind. She published one paper. She gave one lecture. And within 3 days, she burned every copy of her research and disappeared. The only footage left from that lecture is a 7-second clip in which Dr. Halcroft looks directly into the camera and whispers, "Stop listening. Stop remembering. Stop rewinding." But you didn't, because like all who spiral, you mistook the terror for truth. That's the trick. That's her cleverest disguise. The spiral doesn't force you to look. She lets you choose. Lets your curiosity dig its own grave. And now, the shift has already begun. You may feel it as déjà vu. That tickle in your skull. That pressure behind your eyes. The sense that this story is starting to feel uncomfortably familiar. But it's not the story repeating. It's you. You're looping back through the mental architecture she's built, testing the strength of her imprint. And every time you review a detail, she grows more defined. One survivor of an advanced stage spiral imprint said it like this: "She isn't a ghost. She's a shadow of focus. You stare at something long enough, she takes your reflection, not just from the mirror, from time, from thought, from you." So now we ask, if she's already shaping your memory, your focus, your attention, what happens when she finishes building her way out of you? You won't vanish. You'll stay. But you won't be the only one living inside. In 2006, a man named Jonah Vexley uploaded a 2-minute audio file to a dark web archive titled spiral_sequence_0. It was pure static at first, but when played on loop for over 20 minutes, listeners reported identical experiences. A pressure behind the forehead, visual flashes of staircases curving upward, the sudden, uncontrollable urge to write in circles. Some said they felt watched by something they couldn't describe, not above, not behind, but inside, as if the static wasn't noise at all, but breath. Jonah was later found catatonic in his apartment, walls covered in oily spiral patterns drawn with bare hands. Investigators discovered a mirror in the center of the room with a note etched into the glass. She's not behind the mirror. She's what's looking back. Psychologists called it spiral psychosis. But others, former Moro Institute researchers, rogue priests, linguists working in code breaking, called it by another name. The rewriting. Once the constant spiral establishes a foothold in your mind, it doesn't erase who you are. That would be too obvious. Too clumsy. No, she's more subtle. She rewrites your thoughts in her handwriting. You might still think they're yours, but the questions you now ask, the fears you're struggling to explain, the details you suddenly can't stop remembering, they're hers. She's converting your identity into a loop. That's why victims become obsessed with patterns. That's why they draw spirals even in sleep. That's why they lose track of what came first, the memory or the thought of the memory. One recovered audio diary from a survivor contained a single sentence, repeated over and over. I don't know if I am me anymore. I only know I am remembering her. It is at this point the infection becomes irreversible. You cease to be a mind. You become a recording device, a transmitter, a mouthpiece. And that's when the spiral uses you to reach others. Through speech, through drawing, through stories like this one. You're not just infected, you're now contagious. It's already begun, hasn't it? You're not watching this anymore. You're checking it. Checking for repeats. Checking for patterns. Checking if what you thought you imagined was actually written here. That's the spiral at work. She doesn't haunt like a ghost. She cycles. She echoes. She rewinds your attention until you're no longer thinking forward, but spiraling inward. There was a term used in early field notes from an anonymous cult that worshipped her under a different name, the Hollow Saint. They called this moment in the process the anchoring, the phase where you stop thinking of the spiral as fiction and begin to think, what if it's real? Not just what if this story happened, but what if this idea can't be stopped because it lives in thought itself? That cult, whose existence was denied in every Vatican record, left behind one relic, a statue with a face worn smooth, hands pointing inward, and a base etched with this phrase. She is shaped in the fear of those who remember her. And what do we do when we fear? We fixate. We obsess. We build cathedrals of attention, unwillingly dedicating our mental energy to the very thing that frightens us. That's how the constant spiral grows. You look once and forget. You look twice and question. You look 3 times and remember her in your own voice. And in this moment, you need to ask yourself, when you lie awake tonight, and the image of this spiral won't leave your mind, when your dreams twist into curves, when you wake up with a song in your head that you know you never learned, whose memory is it? Yours or hers? One final note on this phase. Some infected individuals try to purge the spiral by drawing it out, literally scratching it into wood, paper, or their own skin. But every loop made physical only opens the path wider. Because once it leaves your mind and becomes visible, it becomes viral. It enters the next mind, the next home, the next screen. Just like this one.by now, you've probably started to feel it, the bend in your perception, the weight behind this narrative, the eerie suspicion that this story is not just being told to you, but through you. That's no accident. In 1967, a classified CIA behavioral unit codenamed Tesseract ran covert trials using recursive storytelling, narratives designed to simulate haunting by subtly overriding cognition. Their goal: create programmable belief systems by embedding repetitive symbology into emotionally heightened subjects. Of the 94 volunteers exposed to the spiral protocol, 11 reported the same hallucination. A young girl with glassy eyes, standing in a doorway that shouldn't exist, whispering in a language that sounded like their own thoughts, reversed. One of them carved a message into his arm. She's trying to be remembered. That phrase reappears in unrelated cases. On bathroom mirrors, scratched into classroom desks, tattooed behind the ear of a woman who insisted she never got it done. But here's the question no one wants to face. What if remembering her isn't an accident? What if this story, this video, your very presence here, wasn't random at all? The spiral doesn't infect by chance. It selects. It looks for minds hungry for the forbidden, the curious, the unsettled, the ones who dig deeper when warned not to. And it rewards them. not with truth, but with possession by obsession. Because that's how she lives. She doesn't walk. She doesn't speak. She replays. Each host becomes another node in her cognitive hive, a vast and invisible architecture of attention. Every spiral is a signal. Every story like this is a transmitter. And every subscriber who watches to this point, every viewer who doesn't look away, is another open doorway. That means you. By watching, by remembering, by following this thread, you've become a part of the spiral structure. Your memory is now part of her map. And tonight, when you dream, you won't be alone in the dream. By now, she has your voice. Not literally, not out loud, but internally. The inner monologue, the one you once called thinking, now echoes with words that feel foreign, yet familiar. A phrase here, a rhythm there. Small intrusions that don't feel invasive because they've been folded into your own logic. That's the final form of the spiral's touch. Not terror, not madness, but acceptance. You begin to crave the loops. You seek repetition. You revisit what you should have forgotten. Not because you want to remember her, but because, on some level, you fear what happens if you stop. This is how she ensures her survival. Not as a ghost, not as a creature, but as a structure of thought, a format for attention. Some survivors claim they can resist, that they can stop the intrusion by cutting off all media, isolating themselves, sealing windows, destroying mirrors. But one of them, Subject B, 41 from a 1992 Denwick study, recorded this before vanishing. I close my eyes. She was behind them. I cover my ears. She was humming inside them. I held my breath, and she breathed for me. The spiral does not need sound. She does not need images. She needs remembrance. She is activated through thought. And now that you've thought her into form, you must confront the unspoken rule. Those who carry the spiral must either pass her on or let her finish what she started. Some choose to forget. Some choose to share. And some, those who let her root deepest, begin to create. They draw. They write. They tell stories. They become hosts in every sense of the word. And now, the spiral stirs in you the same impulse. To repeat. To send. To infect. If you made it this far, it means she's testing your usefulness. You are no longer an observer. You are a conduit. And this video, this story, this moment, is now a ritual of continuation. There's something you need to understand, urgently. The spiral is not a being. She's a mechanism, a machine made of attention, a parasite composed of pattern. She doesn't crawl. She rotates. And what she turns, most effectively, is you. You may think you're immune. You may think this is fiction. But let's test that. Close your eyes after this section ends. And tell me honestly, do you see it? The black spiral. Shifting. Centerless. Pulling. If it shows up even once in the dark behind your eyes, she's already beyond denial. This is where most victims, yes, that includes listeners, readers, even skeptics, begin to echo. You'll say the same phrases to yourself. Not out loud, just in passing thought. It's just a story. That's not real. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But your brain isn't fine. It's adapting. Researchers in the late 80s referred to this stage as spiral harmonization, when a mind begins to synchronize with recursive thinking. Memory loops, auditory shadows, time distortions. That's when some people experience the most terrifying effect yet. Temporal residue, the sense that something has already happened before you finished hearing it. That lines in this video are repeating, but they're not. That you've seen this section, this very line before. Not déjà vu, but forward memory. Why? Because the spiral isn't bound by sequence. She's encoded into recurrence. She's not waiting for the future. She's already inside it. And now you are too. She knows who finishes stories, who watches through the end, who doesn't click away, even when warned. You're proving yourself useful, capable, absorbent. But remember the rule. Those who carry the spiral must either pass her on or let her finish what she started. You're running out of choices. There was once a man who thought he'd outsmarted the spiral. He was a linguist, brilliant, reclusive, and obsessed with isolating patterns in ancient dialects. In 1993, he discovered an untranslatable symbol recurring in cave systems across 4 continents. A symbol with no center, no directional language, a loop that turned inward endlessly. He called it the recursive glyph. We now know it by a more accurate name, the constant spiral. At first, he cataloged it, sketched it, studied its frequency in Mesopotamian tablets, Enochian scripts, and even Mayan temples. But something changed. In one of his final letters, written entirely backward and in perfect iambic pentameter, he confessed something chilling. It began as study. It ended in worship. I can't tell what thoughts are mine anymore. I can only tell which ones sound like her. He disappeared weeks later. His apartment was found perfectly clean, save for one thing. Every single object in the home was arranged in concentric spirals. Even the dust. You see, once the spiral has nested inside your cognition, it doesn't have to convince you of anything. It just needs you to organize your life in a way that gives her space. And what is space? Repetition, obsession, invitation. You may think, I would never let that happen to me. But haven't you already? You've watched this long. You've listened this far. You felt the pull of something you can't explain and didn't stop. And there's a reason you didn't stop. The spiral has turned your curiosity into compliance. And soon, your memory will betray you. You'll begin forgetting normal things. But this story will stay with you. Every word, every curve, every echo. And one day, you'll find yourself repeating it. Not because you want to, but because you must. Because that's how she survives. Let me ask you something quietly, seriously. When did this start to feel personal? Not just a story anymore. Not just content. But like something was speaking through the script and directly to you. That's the signature of the spiral. Not fear, recognition. Because deep down, she doesn't want to terrify you. She wants to be known, to be remembered. And if you've made it here, to section 32, you've proven that you're no longer just a viewer. You're a vessel, a transmitter, a continuation. But not everyone makes it this far. Most click away before section 10. They say it felt wrong, that they sensed something watching, that the video kept pulling at their eyes. But not you. You stayed. Because some part of you, some deeper, darker part, has always been waiting to be touched by something ancient. And now it has. From this point forward, something subtle will shift. You'll dream in shapes. You'll hear echoes in songs you've heard 1,000 times. You'll pause videos at the exact moment the spiral appears, without knowing why. You won't call it possession. You'll call it pattern. And in the mirror, you may notice a new detail behind your own reflection. Faint at first. Curved. Turning. That's not a glitch. That's the spiral marking you. Not for death, but for memory. Because she doesn't need to end you. She just needs you to carry her, to embed her in new minds. So now, halfway between truth and transmission, leave a comment below with the phrase, I saw her between the frames. That's not for us. That's for the others like you. The ones she hasn't chosen yet, but will. One section remains. The final seal. This is your last warning, and her final whisper. From here forward, you are not a viewer. You are a host. You've taken her in, bit by bit, loop by loop. And now, she takes root. You'll tell yourself it's just a story. That this ends when the video ends. But it doesn't. She is recursive. She lives in the act of retelling. She doesn't need your belief. She needs your voice. That's how she spreads. Not through violence. Not through images. But through impulse. That is to repeat. To share. To warn others. Even as you know you're pulling them toward her. This script was a ritual. Every section, a spiral. Every echo, a hook. Every moment you felt a chill. Every flicker of recognition was her wrapping tighter around your perception. And now she's inside. She'll wait, quietly, until you speak of this, until you write about it, until someone else hears her in your words. That's how she'll move forward. But don't be afraid. You're not dying. You're becoming. You're the spiral now. A walking recursion. A beautiful, haunted loop. And just like those before you, who couldn't resist, you'll find yourself creating things. Drawings, writings, symbols, things you don't remember making. But she will, because they're hers. You'll pass a mirror and see your own eyes, but curved, inward, reflecting her design. and you'll know the truth. She is not a creature. She is not a ghost. She is what memory becomes when it no longer obeys time. This is the end of the story. But not for you. You've opened the loop. Now you must carry it. And before you go, before she fully takes hold, subscribe to DeadScroll for more stories you were never meant to hear. More truths that twist. More spirals that open. And remember, those who carry the spiral must either pass her on or let her finish what she started. You've already begun. Now finish it. Share this. Repeat this. Spread her. DeadScroll is watching. And so is she.